"I'm sorry, Mr. Cole. I thought you were already in the car. Your wife just left with the gentleman in the black Range Rover." The valet was young, maybe 22, and he was looking at me with a mixture of pity and terror. He held my keys out like they were made of live wire. Behind him, the glass doors of the charity gala reflected a world I no longer recognized. I could still hear the muffled bass of the orchestra inside, the clinking of champagne flutes, the sound of 1,000 people pretending to care about a cause. I looked at the empty space at the curb where our SUV should have been. Then I looked at the boy. "The gentleman?" I asked. My voice was level. Not a tremor. "Mr. Mercer, sir. From the tech firm. They seem to be in quite a hurry." I took my keys. The metal was cold. "Thank you, Leo. Get yourself something warm to drink. It's a long shift." I tucked a $50 bill into his hand and walked toward the parking structure. I didn't call her. I didn't scream. That was the moment I stopped being her husband and started being observant. Most men, in that 30-second window, would have felt the world collapse. They would have experienced the hot, stinging rush of adrenaline, the blurring of vision, the frantic need to chase the taillights. I felt none of that. Instead, I felt a familiar, icy cooling. It's the sensation a seasoned pilot feels when an engine cuts out at 30,000 feet. You don't have the luxury of panic. You only have the necessity of physics. You check your altitude. You check your glide ratio. You look for a place to land where you won't be obliterated. I sat in my Audi, the interior smelling of leather and the expensive cedar air freshener Marissa insisted on. I watched the dash clock. 8:42 p.m. I began to catalog the facts. Fact 1, Marissa had been distancing herself for 6 months. Fact 2, Finn Mercer's venture-backed startup had been the primary sponsor of this evening's gala. Fact 3, I had been the anonymous donor who provided the matching grant that made the evening possible. The irony was almost poetic. I had literally paid for the stage where my wife performed her exit. As I drove home, not to the brownstone, but to a small private office I kept under a different name, I realized that Marissa had made a fundamental error. She had mistaken my silence for weakness. She had mistaken my restraint for a lack of ambition. She saw Finn Mercer, flashy, loud, wearing a 6-figure watch he hadn't actually paid for. And she saw power. She saw me, the man who reviewed her credit card statements without comment. And she saw utility. She didn't understand who actually controlled the life she was so eager to flaunt. She didn't realize that the very roof over her head, the car she was currently riding in with another man, and the social standing she used as a weapon were all variables in an equation I had written years ago. The fallout wouldn't be loud. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of a scene. I wouldn't give Finn the ego boost of a physical confrontation. This would be legal, quiet, and entirely irreversible. Ever realize the person you trusted was playing a completely different game? Like this video, subscribe for more strategies and comment below where in the world you're watching from. It helps me find those who valued the long game. To the public, I am Joshua Cole, a low-key business consultant. It's a title that is intentionally vague. It allows me to move through high-stakes rooms without being the center of gravity. I grew up with a father who lost everything because he couldn't stop talking about what he was going to do. He chased the big score with a megaphone in his hand, alerting his competitors to every move before he made it. I learned early that the loudest person in the room is usually the most vulnerable. I built my wealth in the shadows of the secondary market, distressed assets, intellectual property holding companies, and private equity. I don't own things directly. I own the entities that own the things. Finn Mercer is my polar opposite. He is a peacock. He lives for the Series A announcement and the cover of Fast Company. He needs the world to believe he's winning, so he can borrow the capital to keep the lights on. He is a man built of glass and debt. Marissa was drawn to that light. We met 12 years ago. I was 29 already, wealthy but living like a graduate student. She was 26, a brand manager with a hunger in her eyes that I mistook for shared ambition. In those early days, we were a team, or so I thought. We lived in a cramped apartment in the city, eating takeout on the floor while she talked about the empire we would build. "You have so much potential, Josh," she'd say, smoothing back my hair. You're the smartest person, I know. You just need to show the world. You need to dress the part. People need to know who you are." I laughed then. I thought she was being supportive. I didn't realize she was actually auditioning me for a role I had no interest in playing. I let her upgrade my life. I let her pick the $4 million brownstone, the Italian furniture, the social circle of high-earning, high-stress influencers. I did it because I loved her, and because, frankly, the cost was a rounding error in my portfolio. I treated our marriage like a partnership where I provided the capital and she provided the brand. But the brand grew tired of the CEO. She thought I was still becoming someone, I whispered to the empty office, as I pulled up her personal bank records. She didn't realize I had already arrived. I opened a secure encrypted drive and clicked on a folder labeled Marissa, Contingency. I had created this folder 3 years into our marriage. Not because I didn't trust her then, but because I don't trust anything that doesn't have a failsafe. In my world, you don't sign a contract without an exit clause. You don't buy a building without an inspection. And you don't merge your life with another person without understanding the structural integrity of the union. I looked at a photo of us from last Christmas. She was leaning into me, smiling, her hand, bearing the 5-carat diamond I'd bought her, resting on my chest. She looked happy. But looking at it now, through the lens of what Leo the valet had told me, I could see the cracks, the way her smile didn't reach her eyes, the way she was already leaning away, toward the camera, toward the next thing. I picked up my phone. It was nearly midnight. "Daniel," I said when the call connected. "It's Joshua." "It's late, Josh," Daniel Harper replied. His voice was like a heavy blanket, dull, thick, and reliable. "Is this about the Singapore acquisition?" "No," I said. I watched a notification pop up on my screen. Marissa's phone had just checked into a boutique hotel downtown. "I need you to pull the primary trust documents. The ones with the infidelity and asset protection riders we drafted in 2019. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "She went for it, didn't she?" Daniel asked. "She's currently at the Nomad with a man named Finn Mercer," I said. I felt a strange, detached sense of relief. The waiting was over. The observation phase was complete. "I want the filing ready by Monday, but I don't want her served yet. What's the play?" "The play," I said, looking at the city lights, "is to let her believe she's the one leaving me. I want her to feel the full weight of her choice before she realizes she's choosing a desert." "Josh, you're so stable. But Finn? Finn is electric." Marissa had said that 3 months ago. Swirling a glass of Pinot she didn't realize cost $400 a bottle. She thought it was a house, red. That was the problem with our marriage in a nutshell. She enjoyed the fruit but had no interest in the roots. I sat in my home office, the glow of 3 monitors illuminating the cold coffee on my desk. To Marissa, I was a mid-level consultant who worked long hours for a comfortable living. She didn't know that I had spent the last decade building a fortress of holding companies, shell corporations, and offshore trusts. I didn't hide the money because I was a miser. I hid it because wealth is a target. I'd seen what happens when people know exactly how much you have. They stop seeing a human and start seeing a resource. I wanted a wife who loved the man, not the portfolio. But as it turns out, Marissa didn't even love the man. She loved the potential of a man. The resentment didn't start with a scream, it started with a sigh. It was the way she looked at her friends' Instagram stories, the ones married to the loud-talking VCs and the disruptive founders. She'd show me a photo of a private jet interior and say, "Must be nice to really live, Josh. To not just survive, but to conquer." I'd look up from my spreadsheets, the ones tracking my $50 million position in a lithium mine, and just nod. "I like our life, Riss. It's quiet." "Quiet is just another word for invisible," she'd snap, turning back to her phone. Then came Finn Mercer. He was the perfect antagonist for a man like me. He was all surface tension. He wore Italian suits 3 sizes too tight and spoke in buzzwords like synergy and disruption. He was a venture-backed executive whose company, Nodal, was essentially a glorified spreadsheet with a sleek UI. I saw them together for the first time at a gallery opening. I watched from the bar as he leaned in close to her, his hand hovering just inches from her waist. He was pitching her on a brand partnership, but his eyes were pitching a different kind of merger. I didn't step in. I didn't mark my territory. I just watched. I noticed the way Marissa's pupils dilated when he mentioned his 8-figure exit strategy. She was a moth, and he was a very bright, very expensive-looking flame. Confirmation didn't require a private investigator. It just required a basic understanding of digital footprints. Marissa thought she was being clever. She used a burner app for their texts, but she forgot that our home Wi-Fi was routed through a hardware-level security gateway I'd installed myself. Every packet of data was logged. Every "I miss you and he's working late again" was archived in a neat chronological file on my server. I sat there, reading their plans for the St. Regis, and felt nothing. No, that's a lie. I felt a sense of completion. The data was finally whole. I chose observation over confrontation because clarity is more valuable than relief. If I confronted her now, she'd cry, she'd lie, she'd blame my workaholic nature. She'd make it a mess. And in a mess, assets get divided by emotion. In a structure, assets get divided by law. The Monday after the gala, I didn't go to my usual office. I went to a nondescript building in the financial district, the kind of place where the names on the directory don't match the names on the payroll. I was emotionally detached. The woman I had loved 12 years ago, the one who ate Thai food on the floor, was gone. In her place was a social climber who was willing to trade a decade of loyalty for a seat on a fake private jet. I wasn't angry, I was just rebalancing the books. "The trusts are ironclad," Daniel Harper said, sliding a thick blue folder across his mahogany desk. Daniel was 55, gray-haired, and possessed the emotional range of a stone gargoyle. He was the only person who knew the true extent of my net worth. He had spent 20 years making sure that if I ever fell, I wouldn't hit the ground. "Marissa's name is on the deed to the brownstone," Daniel continued. "But the brownstone is owned by Waverly Holdings, which is owned by a BVI trust. She has a right to occupy clause that terminates upon a filing for divorce involving proven infidelity. If you've ever stayed silent just to see how far someone would go with their lie, comment masterclass below. It lets me know who understands the value of the long game." "And her personal accounts?" I asked. "She has her salary from the branding agency," Daniel said, his lips curling into something that might have been a smile. "And she has the $50,000 household allowance you transfer every month. As of this morning, she's moved $40,000 of that into a private account she thinks I can't see. She's building a nest egg," I said. "With Finn." "Finn is broke, Josh," Daniel said, leaning back. "My team did a deep dive. His company is 6 weeks from insolvency. He's looking for a lifeline. He thinks Marissa is his entry point into your capital." I laughed. It was the first time I'd laughed in days. "He thinks she's the one with the money." "Exactly. He sees the lifestyle. He sees the coal name. He thinks he's stealing a princess. He doesn't realize he's stealing a debt." The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in performance art. I came home every night at 6:30. I kissed Marissa on the cheek. I asked about her day. I listened to her talk about her meetings with Finn. I watched her check her reflection in the hallway mirror, adjusting her dress, her eyes already out the door. She grew more confident every day. She started leaving her phone face up on the counter. She started making girls' trip plans that I knew were actually weekend getaways to Cabo with Finn. She thought my silence was a sign of my obliviousness. She thought she was the lead actress in a brilliant drama, and I was just a background extra. "You seem distracted lately, Josh," she said one night, her hand resting on my shoulder. It was a calculated touch. Just enough to keep me hooked, but not enough to be genuine. "Just work, Riss," I said, looking at the screen. "A lot of moving parts. I'm just trying to make sure everything is where it belongs." "You worry too much," she whispered, leaning down to kiss my forehead. "Life is meant to be lived." Her certainty came from my silence. She felt safe because I didn't react. She felt powerful because she thought she was tricking a man who was too boring to notice a betrayal right in front of his face. She didn't realize she was living inside a structure she didn't control. She was a tenant in her own life, and her lease was about to expire. I waited for the trigger. I waited for her to make the first move. In a hostile takeover, you never fire the first shot. You just make sure you're the only one with ammunition when the shooting starts. The trigger came on a rainy Tuesday, the kind of day where the gray sky makes everything look honest. Marissa didn't even try to hide the glow in her eyes. She was packing a Rimowa suitcase, the expensive aluminum one I'd bought her for our 10th anniversary. She told me she was heading to a leadership retreat in Sedona. I knew the flight manifest for Finn's private charter was actually headed to a vineyard in Napa. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching her fold silk into neat squares. "You're taking a lot of evening wear for a retreat, aren't you?" I asked, leaning against the frame. She didn't miss a beat. "There's a closing gala, Josh. You know how these things are. Image is everything." She zipped the bag with a finality that felt like a guillotine dropping. She walked over and brushed her hand against my cheek, her eyes already calculating the distance between us. "Try not to work too hard while I'm gone. You look tired. Maybe go for a walk? Get some fresh air?" "I think I'll do exactly that," I said. As soon as her Uber pulled away, I didn't go for a walk. I went to my desk. I sent a single encrypted message to Daniel, "Execute Protocol Alpha." Within 20 minutes, the digital walls began to move. The first thing I did was revoke the authorized user status on the primary black card. I didn't cancel it, that would be too loud. I simply lowered the limit to $200. Enough for a meal, but not enough for a getaway. Next, I triggered the change of circumstance clause in the Waverly Holdings operating agreement. Since the brownstone was technically an office asset of a trust Marissa was no longer a beneficiary of, her access codes would expire in 48 hours. I sat there in the silence of the house, watching the rain streak the windows. Most people think revenge is about fire. They think it's about burning the house down with the person inside. But real power is about oxygen. You don't need to set a fire if you just slowly remove the air from the room. I wanted her to feel the vacuum. I wanted her to realize that the air she'd been breathing, the luxury, the security, the very ground she walked on, was a gift she had treated as a right. If you've ever seen someone realize they've lost everything before they even know the game has started, comment 0 hour below. It's the moment the mask slips. I spent the next 3 days in a state of clinical efficiency. I moved the last of our shared liquid assets into a segregated escrow account. I redirected our mail to a P.O. box. I even contacted the gallery where Marissa had purchased several pieces of art on the company dime and informed them that the transactions were unauthorized and the pieces would be returned for a full refund. By Friday, the silence was broken. My phone began to vibrate on the mahogany desk. It was Marissa. I didn't answer. Then came the texts. "Josh? My card was declined at the hotel. There must be a mistake. Josh, pick up. Finn's card isn't working either. Is the bank down? Joshua. Why can't I get into the travel portal? Answer me." I waited until the sun began to set before I sent the only reply she'd get for the rest of the weekend. "I took your advice, Riss. I went for a walk. I've never seen things more clearly." The collapse phase was designed to be a slow realization, but the courtroom confrontation was where the structure would finally become visible to her. 2 weeks later, we were standing in a sterile wood-paneled room in front of Judge Evelyn Ross. Marissa had hired a high-priced divorce attorney, a man named Sterling who looked like he'd been carved out of tan leather and ego. He spent the first 20 minutes talking about marital standard of living and equitable distribution of the Cole fortune. Finn was sitting in the back of the gallery, wearing a smirk that said he'd already spent the settlement in his head. Marissa sat next to her lawyer, looking like the grieving widow of a marriage she had killed. She looked at me with a mix of pity and simmering anger, as if I were a bug she was about to squash. Then Judge Ross turned to the financial disclosures. "Mr. Harper," the judge said, looking at Daniel over her spectacles, "the petitioner is claiming 50% of the residential property at 42nd Street, as well as half of the liquid assets in the Cole primary account. Your response indicates zero ownership?" Daniel stood up, his movements as precise as a watchmaker's. "That is correct, Your Honor. If you look at Exhibit C, the property in question is held by a discretionary trust established 5 years prior to the marriage. The Cole primary account is actually a corporate expense account owned by an offshore entity. Mrs. Cole was a guest in that home, and an authorized user of that account, but she holds zero equity, Marissa's lawyer scoffed. Your Honor, this is a shell game. Mr. Cole is a consultant. This is his income. Actually, Daniel said, his voice dropping an octave, Mr. Cole is an employee of the trust. He draws a salary of $85,000 a year. That is his total personal income. Everything else, the cars, the travel, the art, is property of the holding company, which is governed by a strict morality and fiduciary clause. I watched Marissa's face. The color didn't just leave her cheeks, it seemed to leave her entire body. She turned to look at me, her mouth slightly open. I didn't look back. I kept my eyes on the judge. And what about the $5 million in the legacy fund? Sterling asked, his voice losing its confidence. That fund was liquidated yesterday, Daniel replied calmly. The proceeds were donated to the charity gala Mrs. Cole attended last month. As per the prenuptial rider, any assets derived from Mr. Cole's premarital holdings are at his sole discretion for charitable contribution. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Marissa turned her head slowly to look at Finn in the back row. Finn wasn't smirking anymore. He was looking at his phone, his face pale. He was realizing that the princess he had stolen didn't come with a kingdom. She came with a mountain of debt and a branding job that paid $75,000 a year. That was the moment I thought that. Marissa realized she'd been living inside a structure she didn't control. She had spent years treating me like a stepping stone. She had looked at my quiet life and seen a man who was stagnant. She never realized that I wasn't standing still, I was holding the leash. I had built a world so complete, so perfectly engineered, that I could remove her from it without leaving a single scar on the architecture. The judge looked at Marissa, then back at the documents. Mrs. Cole, Judge Ross said, her voice devoid of sympathy. It appears you've been living quite far above your means on someone else's credit. This court finds the prenuptial agreement valid and the trust structures ironclad. Marissa lunged toward the table, her voice a jagged whisper. Josh? You can't do this. We're a family. You love me. I finally looked at her. For the first time in weeks, I spoke. I loved the woman who sat on the floor and ate Thai food with me, Marissa. But you evicted her a long time ago. I'm just cleaning up the house. The aftermath of a courtroom collapse is rarely like the movies. There are no dramatic outbursts, only the hollow sound of a briefcase snapping shut and the heavy realization that the life you thought you owned has vanished. Marissa stood frozen as Judge Ross vacated the bench. Her lawyer was already checking his watch. He knew the billable hours were over because the tap had run dry. Finn Mercer didn't wait for her. By the time Marissa turned toward the gallery to find him, he was already halfway to the door. He didn't offer a consoling hand or a, "We'll get through this." He moved with the frantic energy of a man whose last life jacket had just been shredded. He had been looking for a payday, and he'd found a liability. I walked out of the courtroom and into the hallway. The marble floors echoed with the sound of my footsteps, steady, rhythmic, unchanged. Marissa caught up to me near the elevators. She was trembling. The poise she'd spent a decade perfecting finally cracked wide open. "Josh, stop," she hissed, grabbing my sleeve. "You set me up. You knew about Finn for months and you just sat there." I stopped and looked at her. Really looked at her. The jasmine perfume was there, but the arrogance was gone. "I didn't set you up, Marissa. I just stopped maintaining the illusion. You're the one who walked out of the house. I just changed the locks." "I have nothing," she screamed, her voice bouncing off the high ceilings. A few clerks looked up from their desks. "Everything I built, every connection, the house, the life, you're just going to take it?" "I'm not taking anything that belongs to you," I said calmly. "You have your salary, you have your clothes, you even have that Rimowa suitcase you liked so much. But the life you're talking about? That was a service provided by a husband you decided wasn't enough for you. The service has been discontinued. If you've ever had to tell someone that the free ride is officially over, comment account closed below. It's the hardest conversation you'll ever have, but the most necessary." She tried to pivot. She tried the old Marissa, the one who could soften me with a look. Her eyes welled up with practiced tears. "Josh, please. I made a mistake. Finn. He's nothing. He's a parasite. I was lost. We can fix this. We can go back to how it was." "That's the thing about structures, Marissa," I said as the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. "Once you compromise the foundation, the whole thing becomes a hazard. It's not about forgiveness. It's about engineering. The building is no longer safe to inhabit." I stepped inside. She tried to follow, but I held up a hand, a simple, firm gesture that stopped her in her tracks. As the doors closed, the last thing I saw was her reflection in the polished brass, a woman who had spent so much time looking for the next best thing that she'd forgotten to value the thing she had. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of quiet transition. I didn't go back to the brownstone. I didn't need to. I had moved into a suite at a hotel I owned through a subsidiary, a place where the staff knew me by a different name and the windows overlooked a park I'd helped preserve. Daniel called me on Saturday morning. "It's done," he said. The final papers were signed by her counsel. "She's moving out of the 42nd Street property as we speak." I sent a crew to oversee the removal of her personal items. Only her personal items, Josh. Everything else stays. "And Finn?" I asked. "Worse than we thought." Daniel chuckled. "Nodal went into receivership yesterday. The board fired him. It turns out he was using company funds to lease that Range Rover and pay for the Napa trip. He's facing a shareholder derivative suit. He's not just broke, he's radioactive." I hung up and looked at the city. For years, I had been the silent partner in my own life. I had allowed Marissa to be the face of us because it was easier, because I thought it made her happy. I had lived in a state of emotional restraint, holding back my true self to fit into the box she'd built for me. But as I watched the sun set over the skyline, I realized that the restraint wasn't for her benefit. It was my armor, and I didn't need it anymore. I opened my laptop and looked at a new file. It wasn't a spreadsheet or a trust document. It was a list of places I'd wanted to go. Not the high-status destinations Marissa craved, but the quiet, rugged places where a man can disappear into the landscape. Patagonia, the Scottish Highlands, a small vineyard in Tuscany that didn't have a website. I was 41 years old. I had more wealth than I could spend in 3 lifetimes, and, for the first time since I was a teenager, I had no one to perform for. The Joshua Cole the world knew. The boring consultant, the stable husband, the quiet provider, was a character I was retiring. I wasn't going to become a peacock like Finn. I didn't need a loud suit or a flashy car to feel significant. I just needed to be honest. I picked up my phone and made a reservation for one at a small hole-in-the-wall sushi place I used to love before Marissa decided it wasn't up to our standards. As I walked out of the hotel, the doorman nodded. "Good evening, Mr. Cole. Heading out?" "Actually," I said, smiling for the first time in a long time, "I think I'm finally coming home." The game was over. The structure was empty. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just observing the world. I was in it. The following week was a study in silence. I had expected the phone to ring with apologies, threats, or perhaps a final desperate plea from Marissa's family. But there was nothing. When you systematically remove the financial oxygen from a relationship, you find that the friends and connections dissipate like smoke in a high wind. Without the Cole name to open doors and the Cole credit line to buy the rounds, Marissa had become a ghost in her own social circle. I spent Tuesday morning in a glass-walled office that actually belonged to me. No more consulting pretenses. I sat across from Daniel Harper, who was flipping through a stack of finalized transfer deeds. "She's out," Daniel said, not looking up. She took 3 suitcases and a collection of designer shoes. The movers tried to take the Eames chair, but my security lead stopped them at the service elevator. "It's back in the living room." "How did she look?" I asked. I wasn't looking for satisfaction. I was looking for a closing metric, like someone who just realized the difference between net worth and credit limit, Daniel replied. He finally looked up, his gray eyes sharp. "She tried to call Finn from the lobby. The number was disconnected. He's gone, Josh, vanished into the legal weeds. Last I heard, he's staying in a studio apartment in Queens belonging to a cousin he hasn't spoken to in a decade. The Range Rover was repossessed yesterday. I nodded. It was a clean break. But Act 6 wasn't just about the divorce. It was about the aftermath of a life lived in hiding. I'd spent 15 years downplaying my intellect and my assets to maintain a peace that turned out to be a lie. Now, I had to figure out what a man like me does when he no longer has to play the unremarkable husband. I started with the employees. I had dozens of people working for my various entities who only knew me as a signature on a digital paycheck. I spent the afternoon making calls, not as a consultant, but as the owner. I tightened the governance on the trusts and directed a significant portion of the legacy fund, the money Marissa thought she was entitled to, into a foundation for underfunded legal clinics. If Marissa wanted to see what real conquering looked like, she could watch me dismantle the systems that allowed people like Finn to prey on the ambitious. If you've ever reached the end of a long, hard road and realized the view was better than you imagined, comment new chapter below. It's the sound of the page turning. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to the public library. Not a gala, not a rooftop bar, but a quiet place of stone and books. I sat in the reading room and realized that for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't scanning the room for threats or checking my watch for Marissa's next social requirement. My phone buzzed. An unknown number. Joshua? It was Marissa. Her voice was thin, stripped of its usual melodic confidence. She sounded tired. I'm at a motel in Jersey. My phone is almost dead and my last card just got flagged. I don't have anywhere to go, Josh. Please. Just one night, just until I figure things out. I looked at the high vaulted ceiling of the library. I thought about the night at the St. Regis. I thought about the way she looked at Finn's arm, her wedding ring absent, her heart already moved out. Marissa, I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. You spent years telling me I had potential. You told me I needed to become someone. Well, this is who I am. I'm the man who plans for every contingency, including this one. What does that mean? She whispered. It means that 6 years ago, I set up a small, irrevocable annuity in your name. It's not much, enough for a modest apartment and groceries. It triggers the moment the final divorce decree is entered. You won't be on the street, but you won't be in the room either. There was a long silence. I could hear her breathing, a ragged, uneven sound. You had that ready? Even back then? I hope for the best, Marissa. But I always build for the worst. You chose the worst. Now you have to live in it. I hung up before she could respond. It wasn't an act of cruelty, it was an act of completion. I had fulfilled my final obligation as a partner. The rest was up to her. I walked out of the library and into the cool night air. The city was a grid of lights, a complex machine of millions of people all chasing something. For the first time, I wasn't chasing. I was just there. I hailed a cab, not a private car, just a yellow cab, and gave the driver an address in a neighborhood Marissa would have called beneath us. It was a small jazz club, tucked away in a basement. I sat at the bar and ordered a whiskey. No Krug, no vintage labels, just a good, honest drink. The man next to me, an older guy with calloused hands and a faded navy cap, nodded at me. Quiet night, he said. The best kind, I replied. I wasn't the low-key consultant anymore. I wasn't the restrained husband. I was just Joshua. And as the music started low and blue and real, I realized that the greatest asset I had ever owned wasn't a building or a trust. It was the silence I finally knew how to use. The weeks following the finality of the divorce were a study in the difference between being lonely and being alone. For 15 years, my life had been a series of performances, a carefully curated, boring persona designed to keep Marissa satisfied while I managed the reality she was too shallow to perceive. Now the stage was empty, the lights were out, and the silence was the most expensive thing I'd ever owned. I spent most of my time in a new office, not the wood-paneled, stuffy room in the financial district, but a converted warehouse space in Brooklyn. No name on the door, no secretary, just high-speed fiber, a few ergonomic chairs, and a window that looked out over the East River. This was where the real Joshua Cole lived. I wasn't just managing assets anymore. I was moving them with a precision that felt like art. I watched Finn Mercer's final descent from a distance. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. The shareholder derivative suit hit him like a freight train. He tried to pivot, tried to launch a comeback consulting firm, but in this industry, reputation is the only currency that doesn't inflate. Once the word got out that he'd been living on the company's dime to impress a woman who was herself living on a husband's credit, he became radioactive. No one would take his calls. I heard he was seen at a mid-tier networking event in Jersey, still wearing the same Italian suit, only now it looked frayed at the cuffs. He was still talking about synergy and disruptive exits, but people were walking away from him before he could finish his pitch. He was a man who had built a life out of smoke, and now the wind had picked up. If you've ever realized that the people who judge you today won't even be in the room tomorrow, comment the long game below. It's a reminder that status is temporary, but strategy is forever. Marissa's trajectory was different. The annuity I'd set up for her, the mercy fund as Daniel called it, was enough to keep her in a clean, one-bedroom apartment in a respectable part of Queens. It wasn't the brownstone. There were no floor-to-ceiling, hydrangeas, or private chefs. It was just a life. She called me one last time, 3 months after the papers were stamped. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity is a hard habit to break. I saw the news about the foundation, she said. Her voice was different now. The melodic lilt was gone, replaced by a flat, weary tone that sounded honest for the first time in a decade. The Cole Legal Clinic. You're giving away more in a month than I thought we were worth in a year. I'm giving away what was always there, Marissa, I said. You just never looked at the numbers. I thought I knew you, Josh. I really did. I thought you were just this stable, predictable man who needed me to make him interesting. She let out a short, bitter laugh. I didn't realize I was the one being managed. I was just another line item in your budget, wasn't I? You were a partner, I corrected her, until you decided you wanted a lead role in someone else's play. I just gave you the exit you were already heading for. Finn is gone, she whispered. He hasn't texted me in 6 weeks. I think he's working in car sales in Delaware. I know, I said, and I did. I knew exactly where Finn was. I knew his credit score, his current address, and the fact that he was 3 months behind on his child support from a previous life Marissa hadn't even known about. But that's not my concern anymore, and it shouldn't be yours. What do you do now? She asked. In that big empty life of yours? I looked at my monitors. I was currently overseeing the acquisition of a renewable energy firm in Northern Europe. I was also learning how to play the cello, and I had a flight booked for a solo hiking trip in the Andes. I live, I said. For the first time, I'm not observing. I'm just living. I hung up and felt the final cord snap. There was no resentment left. Anger is a high-energy emotion, and I'm a man who values efficiency. To be angry at her would be to give her a seat at my table, and that table was now reserved for people who didn't require a mask. I spent that evening at a small gallery in Chelsea, not a high-profile opening with photographers and brand partners, but a quiet Tuesday night. I stood in front of a large abstract canvas, mostly deep blues and jagged whites. It looked like a storm clearing over the ocean. It's about the weight of the water, a voice said next to me. I turned. A woman was standing there, probably in her late 30s, wearing a simple black sweater and jeans. She wasn't looking at me, she was looking at the painting. Her eyes were intelligent, calm, and entirely unimpressed by the room around her. I think it's about the pressure, I said, the way the deep water holds everything together until the surface finally breaks. She turned to look at me then. She didn't look at my watch or the fit of my coat. She looked at my eyes. That's an analytical way of putting it. You an engineer? In a way, I said, extending a hand. I'm Joshua. Maya, she said, her grip firm and brief. You want to tell me more about this pressure, Joshua, or are you just observing? I think I'm done observing, I said. As we walked through the gallery, I realized that for the first time in 15 years, I wasn't wondering what she wanted from me. I wasn't calculating the risk of her betrayal or the cost of her taste. I was just having a conversation. The structure I had built to protect myself, the trusts, the shell companies, the quiet persona, was still there. It was the foundation of my life. But for the first time, I was stepping out of the fortress and into the sunlight. I had been underestimated my entire life, and I had used that as a weapon. But as I laughed at a joke Maya made about the pretentiousness of blue, I realized that the greatest power wasn't in being underestimated. It was in being known.